Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Mormon Stories Podcast. I'm your host, John DeLynn. It's February 20th, 2020. It's 7:47 p.m. Utah time, and we are super excited to be assembling an all-star panel to be discussing something that's really interesting and kind of really important. For those of you who joined us earlier today, we are here to discuss a recent big change within the LDS Church. Yesterday, February 19th, 2020, the LDS Church came out with a bunch of changes to what's called the LDS General Handbook of Instructions. I just did a big old episode introducing it and talking about all the changes. So we're not going to go into in depth. But if you want to go back, if you haven't listened to the first part, go listen to it. You'll get the full context. But basically, it's this huge manual that the church uses to govern the church. It used to be on paper. Now it's on the internet. And now a bunch of stuff that hasn't been made available has been, and it's been consolidated. And it's really interesting. In addition, the church has made a bunch of interesting policy changes around disciplinary councils and excommunication and disfellowship, around what apostasy does and doesn't mean, around what behaviors get you kicked out of the church or penalized or disciplined. Some major changes to how the church treats the LGBTQ community. Several clarifications about transgender Mormons. Some minor changes around women and feminism, and some other general changes. And again, go listen to the first hour and a half to get kind of the comprehensive list. But what we've done today is we're pulling together a wonderful panel of thoughtful individuals who are going to give their perspectives on these changes. And so without any further ado, I will introduce you to our wonderful panel. And we'll ask each panelist to tell us briefly who you are, what you do. And we'll start with Natasha.
Hi, everybody. I'm Natasha Helfer Parker. I am a licensed marriage and family therapist. I am also a certified sex therapist through the organization of ASECT. I have been running the Mormon Mental Health podcast for many years, started with Mormon Stories with John DeLynn, and also do the Mormon Sex Info podcast, run a practice called Symmetry Solutions, where we really provide services mostly to kind of LDS folks and other maybe religious folks who are going through either faith transitions, mixed faith relationships, sexuality issues, etc. So I'm busy and happy and glad to be here.
All right. Thanks for joining us, Natasha. Next on our panel is returning to Mormon Stories, Anthony Miller. Anthony, welcome.
Thank you, John. So I'm Anthony Miller. I'm a dragon dad. Our now 26-year-old son came out to us almost 4 years ago, and that led to a series of events that turned into a faith crisis and led me to join you today, actually. And my interview with you was last August, and I was appreciative of that opportunity. I've co-presented at Sunstone multiple times with Jana, who's part of our group here, and I'm just really grateful for the opportunity to be with you this evening.
Hey, what's the feedback been on that interview, on that episode, Anthony?
It's just been overwhelmingly tender, and still, even this many months later, I'll occasionally get a message or email or a text or something like that of someone who's listened to it or gone through it. Donna Schulwalter just really softened my heart quite a bit. She told me she had watched it like 5 times and like transcribed a bunch of it. And I just think she's a rock star and a hero. And I'm just so honored by that. But I was really grateful for the opportunity to do that.
I love it. Well, we're so glad you're here, Anthony.
Thanks.
Kyle, also returning to Mormon Stories podcast. Kyle, introduce yourself again.
Thanks, John. Yeah, thank you. Happy to be here. Kayal Ashworth. I'm the host of the Latter Gay Stories podcast.
Say that slowly and enunciate.
Latter Gay.
Okay, it's with the G.
Podcast.
All right.
I did reserve Latter-day Stories, just in case someone from the church wanted to pirate the idea.
Wanted to poach on that.
You're gonna be taken to the right place. Host of the Latter-day Stories podcast, gay, former Mormon, father of 4, and really using this platform, which formerly was the Gay Mormon Stories podcast, which we have to credit you, John, for creating that. It is the world's, I would suppose, longest running LGBTQ themed gay Mormon or Mormon themed podcast on this subject. And we're now in our 9th season. So pretty exciting to see that platform take off, and overwhelming response, incredible viewership, listenership, and participation in the podcast, which tells me that either people are so bored that they find excitement only in LGBTQ podcasts, or there are plenty of people out there who are interested in this message. And I think it's probably the latter.
Yeah, I think this touches a lot of people and it's important. So good job, Kyle. Jeana Colton is back with us. Jeana, introduce yourself.
Oh, kia ora, everybody. Kia ora to the co-panelists and John. I'm the host of A Thoughtful Faith podcast, and I am an independent scholar continuing to publish in the field of Mormon scholarship and cultural studies. And I'm currently a religious studies and spiritual formation teacher at a Catholic girls' school. I'm a bit in a pickle religiously. I worship Anglican. My heart's with the community of Christ. I'm culturally Mormon. I'm Roman Catholic by spiritual formation, and ecumenical and interfaith by nature.
Beautiful. I love it.
I love that.
So
Thank
good.
you.
Welcome, Jeana. It's great to have you back. Now, Jana, I'm trying to remember, you've been on Mormon Stories. Of course you have. Reintroduce yourself to my audience.
Thank you. Yeah, I was on a panel a few years ago. So I'm Jana Spangler, and I am a certified life coach, and I work with Natasha at Symmetry Solutions. And I specialize in working with people who are affected by faith transition, either the people themselves or family members or mixed faith marriages. And I'm also a recent graduate of the Living School, which is a contemplative Christian wisdom school that is run by Father Richard Rohr. And I just am fascinated with all things spiritual, all things Mormon. I'm an active member of the church. And maybe that's it.
That's great.
I'm a speaker. I speak at conferences and workshops and on podcasts.
All right. It's great to have you. Thanks for joining us, Jana. And last but not least, someone that'll be new to many of you. We're super excited to have Samantha Taylor joining us today. Samantha, tell us about yourself.
Well, I am a litigation support technician, so a little bit different field than the rest of you. That's basically a combination paralegal, private investigator, and IT person. I came out as trans publicly a little over, it was 2019, so a little over a year ago. And a lot of which was caused by family members and members of the local church. Now I actually serve on the board of the Utah LGBTQ Chamber of Commerce, and I co-chair the LGBTQ Safe Zone project.
Beautiful. Well, we're super glad you've been able to join us today, Samantha. Thanks for joining us.
You're welcome.
Okay. So we've got a bunch of things to cover today. We're welcoming our live audience. We hope our live audience will feel comfortable sharing their questions or comments. We hope to incorporate some of that today. But let's dive right in. I think where it might make sense to begin is with disciplinary council stuff. Whether it's how the church is now changing how it's defining apostasy, to what's a mandatory versus optional offenses that can warrant church discipline, to the renaming of disciplinary councils, to membership councils, to the elimination of the terms excommunication and disfellowship, to replace them with the terms withdrawal of church membership for excommunication, and formal membership restrictions for disfellowshipment. Lots of changes to the Church Disciplinary Council sort of structure. We went into detail on that in the last episode. I think only 2 of us have been through a disciplinary council, but since I've already kind of started to comment on this, Jeana, do you want to give kind of your initial thoughts to or descriptions of some of these changes, since this might be near and dear to your heart?
You want me to give my thoughts on that? I was initially like really excited. I thought they were retiring the whole idea of church discipline. And then it was pointed out to me, actually, they're not. They're just renaming it, which is a really Mormon thing to do. Like, don't interrogate the theology or the pastoral theology or the intention or the policy. Just kind of juggle it around and rename it. I mean, does it make any difference for females? I don't think it does, because we still have the bishops who are in charge of that membership committee, don't we? Is that correct? Do I have that right?
I mean,
they're just retiring the state council.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the stake president has the right to. The bishop has to now. So they're pushing many down to the bishops instead of elevating as many to the stake president and the stake presidency and the stake high council. I guess the bishop has to ask permission from the stake president to hold, and we shouldn't call it a disciplinary council. Now we're calling it a membership council. So now the bishop can do men or women, unless there's a strong likelihood that that withdrawal of membership is likely. Then the stake president's going to take it, and I'm guessing that might be true for men or women. But in theory, the stake president could let the bishop continue to handle the women as they've been handled or mishandled before. Is that helpful, Jeana?
That's so helpful. Well, I mean, it's a barbaric process. It's an absolutely barbaric process. And I think withdrawing the mandatory component of the mandatory, what do you call that, discipline or whatever it is? What do you call it now? What's the verb now?
The verb?
What's the
withdrawing membership, removing membership?
I'm being disciplined. I can't use that, though,
no, it's not disciplined, because they're trying to move away from that.
You're being removed.
It's all lipstick on a pig, really, isn't it? I mean, until they get rid of the whole concept of church discipline in any form, whether you call it a membership withdrawal system or whatever it is, I think it's really a barbaric and medieval process for anybody to go to. I don't thank anybody for my church discipline. I'm sure you don't either, John. It was horrific. It's a terrible, terrible process for anybody to go through. I'm glad they seem to be lightening it up. I'm glad they are detaching the mandatory church discipline for apostasy. But apostasy remains, I think, in the handbook. So
and it's really interesting because they removed it from the list. It used to be mandatory for a disciplinary council if there were grounds for apostasy. Now it's removed from the mandatory list or the optional list, but then it's still listed as something that can lead to a membership council. So it's kind of weird they took it off both lists, but it's still grounds for church discipline. I think that's kind of weird.
So my question would be, what's your read on this? Is your read on this that they've made some changes such that it's less likely that they would withdraw membership or excommunicate the Youngs and the Maloffs and Bruce Holt and the Calderwoods? Under this scenario, is your take that they're less likely to have their membership removed?
I think they're retiring those ideas of excommunication and disfellowshipment because they're barbaric, and it doesn't make very good press. When somebody's been excommunicated and appears all over the Salt Lake Tribune or wherever it is, it sounds terrible on the part of the church. To kind of provide a softer term for it, I think it's really about public relations.
I agree with that. I think, interestingly enough, John, I believe you brought this up earlier. The original layout of the disciplinary council was that for example, in a stake situation, you had 6 of the 12 high counselors, 6 were for the accused, and 6 were representing the good name of the church. And I think, interestingly enough, and maybe John has some credit here, when more of these high-profile excommunications were taking place, and the public was had the opportunity to hear the Bill Reels, the people speak. It was
Sam
interesting
Young, Jeremy Reynolds,
how quickly opinion changed. And when I heard about the membership council or the disciplinary councils being changed back in August of last year, there were a number of reasons that I heard that were cited for these upcoming changes. One of them, we've discussed this, John, the idea that you have a room of 15 men in a stake who some are hearing for the first time the church's history or inaccuracies or difficulties in history. And that's a really difficult situation for a stake president to overcome when 12 of his highest church leaders are now going back to him after the excommunication saying, was brother or sister so-and-so actually correct in some of these teachings? And that was causing some discord. Also, I think the message the church would have us understand and believe is that those disciplinary councils were just taking so much time from that group of 15 that if we excuse them out of that meeting, they have more time to spend with their families. And I think that that's very soft and comforting, but I don't know that that really is the answer to why these councils were dissolved.
Yeah, so it was last mid-year when they decided to make a change and they disfellowshipped the Lusks. Is that right? Instead of excommunicated them?
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Yeah, and so maybe what we're seeing in the manual now is just kind of a continuation of a change of policy that they maybe tested out or they were thinking when they decided to disfellowship the Lusks instead of excommunicate them.
That would suggest that there's a level of that would suggest that there's a level of coordination. I don't think there is. I really don't think that there's any fact finding or any feedback offered to the people who are making these decisions. That's my thought. I think that these are isolated things that aren't necessarily governed by Salt Lake.
My hope was that. Well, are you saying that's the party line, or you really think that's true, Gina? Because my hope was, and my intuition is, that when we show up at Sam Young's stake chapel and do a vigil in his parking lot with the news media there, when Kate Kelly does that, when that's done at mine, when we do that at the Youngs, when we're like Facebook live streaming the disciplinary council and like pointing the camera into the stake high council and sort of taking back and taking the shame out of excommunication, but actually making it something we're proud of and then broadcasting it all over the world. It brings this big spotlight that becomes a disinfectant, and the brethren just realize that the costs of excommunication are much higher than the benefits. That's, maybe I'm projecting, but that's kind of how I interpret these changes. Do you think?
I agree.
I see a lot of these changes as being rather Orwellian in nature. Like Gina was saying, to use the term from 1984, it sounds a lot like newspeak. Let's soften the terms. Let's prepare people to, for when we throw everything down the memory hole a couple years from now. It's quite problematic for a lot of reasons. I think Kurt and McConkie, when they wrote the manual, made some big oversights. But what mostly bugs me about it is, like you were saying, John, we're taking excommunications and discipline out of the public eye, and we're taking away any sort of oversight. We don't have those 12 other high council members whose opinion was more or less irrelevant because the stake president always made the final decision in the past, but they could attempt to influence or go back and report that they didn't like how things went down. Now there's no oversight. It's just the bishop or just the stake president, unless he chooses to bring.
And they're counselors, right?
Not necessarily. I might have to go back and reread that, but I was focused on different sections.
Yeah, it was interesting. I was able to find that the bishop is the structure of the council within the ward remains the same, but I don't know that I saw exactly whether or not the stake counselors and the stake clerk is included in that process.
My understanding
Good
is it's
question.
the stake presidency and the stake high council is optional, or it's the bishopric with the approval of the stake president. That's my understanding.
Either way, we've dropped a considerable amount of oversight. So if
That's
you have
right.
a local leader who wants to go rogue, it's very, very easy, very, very difficult to overrule them. And on the other hand, if you get just one very loyal member in leadership, then you can control the disciplinary system very, very easily.
That's a good point.
And in my experience with any excommunication that I saw or participated in, or had friends that participated in, I didn't ever see the High Council as a group that would help sway a stake president's decision. It was always the stake president.
Absolutely.
So I guess if I can just offer a little bit of a mental health perspective, at least that's the lens I'm trying to bring tonight rather than personal, I guess, is I've always been a big proponent that language does matter. And I do think that softening language can be a positive sign. At the same time, honesty also matters. And so if the intent behind this is just to kind of go ahead with the same behaviors as before, and to the many points that have been made now lowers the ability of accountability, I think that's very problematic. I do think that there is a positive in having 1 to 3 people know your business versus 15 from a confidentiality perspective.
Good point.
And we don't make a lot of good confidentiality choices or trainings in, I would say, Mormon leadership land. At the same time, the roulette issue is big because now, to, again, the point that Samantha and several of you have made, there's less accountability. I think that the other point is that it puts people who resign on the same level. So there's no difference really now between, noting whether or not I removed myself or the church removed me, which I think is also problematic as far as taking away maybe ownership of that decision.
Ooh, that's interesting. So you're saying that if you say my membership has been removed, it's unclear, it's ambiguous. That's what you're saying? Because but you can say the church removed my membership versus I resigned, right?
Yeah, at the same time, I think the status that the church in particular will say will kind of level the playing field. And that's not my idea, by the way. That was actually a commenter, I forget who kind of pointed that out in an earlier thread.
It's interesting.
I do think that there are issues, to Gina's point, with discipline altogether. And until we really get to the bottom of that whole kind of tradition that we have, a tradition of our fathers, which I think is interesting that we always miss our best doctrine by, keeping stupid traditions. But I think that is a non-boundaried process where there are power differentials that are very potentially harmful to members of the church. I also think that it exacerbates secrecy and bad habits in those regards for most members who do not want the public humiliation of certain types of church discipline results, which become very public when you can't do things like attend the temple, pass the sacrament, things of that nature. I also think it puts bishops in a very kind of vulnerable, liable position that I'm always concerned about bishops and how much they're carrying mental health-wise themselves. And I would say that from parenting research, we know that punishment doesn't really do a lot in regards to helping good results in families. So why would that be any different in organizations? So going to I really enjoyed the ministering language that we moved to a few years ago now. And I wish that was more how we dealt with issues of quote unquote sin or, even issues of criminality or things like that. I don't think that even in issues of criminality that there should be necessarily church discipline. It can be, how are we going to minister to people who are being accountable by the criminal system and should be held accountable by the criminal system. So lots and not to mention also that whether you call it excommunication or removal of membership, there are still many, many psychological factors for families when it comes to all of our theology around the afterlife. What does this mean for our family? Are we still sealed? Are we not? And none of those things change whether you call it something different. So those were my mental health perspectives.
I love it. What do you guys think about the argument that it's actually less barbaric to say the church, there's less stigma, there's less negative stigma for the disciplined to be able to say, oh, the church removed my membership versus the church excommunicated me? I feel like, even though I'm proud now to have said I was excommunicated, I think for the average member, if you just say, oh, the church removed my membership, isn't that a little less stigmatizing and negative than to say the church excommunicated me?
Tomatoes, tomatoes.
That's what you think, Samantha? All right. Others? Anyone else?
I think it's cooler to say that you're excommunicated.
It is cooler.
Yeah.
Well,
So-
and
So I
let's
get to
remember
say,
too that
I was-
it's only cooler if you're doing it for cool reasons. It's not necessarily
That's true.
cool if you're dealing with some really family disasters that a lot of people are getting disciplined for in regards to abuse or, infidelity or pornography viewing. So it's cool for certain topics.
It's cool for apostasy.
Yes.
But that's not an automatic removal of membership anymore, according to the new standards. So I was going to say that when I was about 14 years old, my father was excommunicated for something other than apostasy, and they called it a church court back then. And they publicly would announce it from the pulpit that he was excommunicated and the reason for the excommunication. So there was this element of public humiliation, calling it a church court, and supposedly when they went from a church court to a disciplinary council, it was to soften the idea. And I kind of see this as trying to do kind of an incremental move to soften it. But in the end, even if you change the words, if they're going to kick somebody out, the result's the same. I agree with Samantha on that.
That's probably the point where they excluded or took out the word Mormon and added the word love. So it was now the court of love.
Right.
I just been reading the actual policy. The counselors are in the room with the bishop or the stake president. Kevin Kloosterman adds that Kevin says that a person can request that the stake high council be in attendance. I haven't confirmed that, but that's what Kevin Kloosterman is reporting.
Yeah, and there were a few caveats to that. It was that if the facts were potentially contested, you could ask for the stake high council to be in the room, or if the disciplinary council, the membership, whatever, involved the stake president or his family, then
oh,
the high
right,
councilors
that's
would be
interesting.
there.
Conflict of interest stuff.
Correct.
Is that for men or men and women?
Men and women.
So a woman now can request a stake high council.
Correct. I think they left the door open that anyone really could, but under those I think there were 3 or 4 caveats were essentially door openers to having the stake high council there. But I think maybe the more broad or general point was that the high counselors would no longer be required to attend those councils.
Also, it makes it clear that the bishop, the presiding officer, the bishop or the stake president makes the final decision. He can counsel with his counselors. They can give their input. They can resolve concerns, but ultimately it's just one person making the decision. There's no voting or anything like that. And I think, just to reiterate a point made, that just multiplies by 8 the number of the variability of this process, because you've got so many different bishops who have so many different opinions. It's sort of the ecclesiastical roulette times 8, which is kind of the average number of wards, I think, or branches in a stake or district. Any other final comments about membership councils before we move on to the criterias for mandatory versus optional membership? I can't remember the name. What is it again? Membership councils? What is it?
So one comment, I think it was Natasha that mentioned this, that it doesn't seem to be any different from if you withdrew your own records now.
Right.
It used to be notated differently as far as I understand, but procedurally it was handled quite the same. While they didn't typically say this officially, it was assumed if you were removing your own name, it was to avoid a disciplinary council because you've committed a grievous sin or are apostate, or you want to just go on sinning. And so in order to be rebaptized, all the same requirements existed in the old version as it did to be rebaptized after having been excommunicated. So it did kind of simplify things by combining that under one name now.
Interesting. Thanks for that, Samantha. Okay, let me read. I talked about this kind of at length before, but let me read what actions are mandatory for disciplinary council. They are murder. Well, let's just say this: before this policy, the things that were mandatory were pretty much things around apostasy. So it was like the only things that were mandatory for a disciplinary council were getting same-sex married, sort of other apostate acts, joining another church and preaching its gospel, false doctrine kind of stuff, being a polygamist. Those things were all mandatory. And then things like rape and murder and child abuse and pedophilia were all optional. And we did our best to make a huge stink about that and to embarrass the church into reconsidering. And so they reconsidered. And this is now, so these are the things that are required. And I want everyone's thoughts on the required: murder, rape, sexual assault conviction, child or youth abuse, violent predatory behavior, incest, child pornography, plural marriage, sexual predatory behavior, financial predatory behavior, fraud and similar activities, serious sin while holding a prominent church position, and any felony conviction. All right, what do people think about that list of mandatory membership councils?
I'm really pleased that affinity fraud is there.
Yeah, that's awesome, right?
Yeah, that's really important for Utah.
Ripping people off.
And I think after Utah's current legislative session, we will see probably a change in the plural marriage issue, because I think decriminalizing that, which is currently at the legislature, and I think probably will likely pass, may have some bearing on that as well. Just like, and we'll probably talk about recreational use of marijuana or cannabis.
Yep.
So I like that the list feels much better than the old list. It feels more consistent with what really is important and what isn't. But I also find myself having some hives over how specific we get. I kind of don't like it either way. We get too specific and it starts feeling like it's overwhelming and pharisaical. When we get not specific enough, then I'm scared to death of bishop roulette and priesthood roulette. And so I don't know that we can win with this kind of stuff, but you do need to have some really good guidelines if you're going to have lay clergy. It's just, you need it because they haven't been to school. They haven't had enough education to necessarily make good decisions about that themselves, other than just their own life experience. But I have had a couple of attorneys point out how problematic actually the all felony charges, any felony convictions can be, because of the wildly different rules about what is a felony conviction in different areas are, and how sticky that can get. And if I just out of curiosity started perusing what a third degree felony is, which is the least of the seriousness of those felonies, there's probably a whole lot of things on that list that I don't know that anyone is going to want to have to convene a membership council over. It seems like overkill. And so I think you're, again, kind of probably putting a bunch of bishops in a position where they're having to choose what they're going to turn a blind eye to, which is easy for some. Some people are good with that. Some personalities that are maybe just a little more legalistic, you're putting them in a huge pickle about whether you're going to really enforce some of these really crazy felonies that, in one state would be nothing, and in another, you're going to be a convicted felon. So I see that as being a bit problematic.
I also think that this puts bishops and ecclesiastical leaders into some type of detective roles. I mean, a lot of these, again, are in the criminal factor of our society. And so there are, adept authorities who are, able to kind of deal with these issues. And even with these issues, even in our legal systems, we oftentimes fail victims, as far as victims of sexual assault, for example. And so I just see it as very complicated, and why I wish we would just kind of do away with this whole system altogether. It's not a bishop's job to start running detective work as to whether or not, a he said, she said type of situation and what that means. I think we do much better focusing on ministering and appropriate boundaries in church settings.
Let me ask Gina or anyone who knows about other churches. Does the Episcopalian Church, the Anglican Church, do they kick you out if you engage in incest or predatory behavior? Does the Catholic Church kick you out if you're sexually assaulting people? Does, the Community of Christ boot you out if you're defrauding people of money? Do you know how that works, Gina?
No, they don't have the same disciplinary systems, the same intricate and disciplinary systems as the LDS Church does. The LDS Church, I think Jehovah's Witnesses is similar. They have a whole disfellowship and public shaming and system. I think the worst that you may get, I think the Catholic Church is excommunicating women who are, and those associated with the ordination of women. There will be excommunication there. That's done at a diocesan level. But it'd be it's very difficult to get excommunicated by the Anglicans.
So most churches, most mainstream churches, they don't have this idea if you make mistakes, we remove your membership. They just you're all members, and that's not in question. Members make mistakes in general.
I think that the suggestion would be that if you are failing in some way, that through the grace of God and Jesus Christ's love, you might be changed. We leave the option open for people to come and, to use that space as sacred space in which they can have transformation. But the difference is that the LDS Church uses membership as a qualification of worthiness. Now, other churches don't do that. That's not there. It's just a table of belonging and opportunity for people to come into sacred space. And everybody needs that, from the lowest sinners to, the most righteous and holy. And so that's the different kind of rubric. That's a different lens through which other churches see it. That's because of the LDS Church's level of exclusivity.
Right. Now, Kyle, we're happy that same-sex marriage drops from the mandatory, disciplinary council sort of list, right?
Yeah, and this is something that we looked forward to after the April 2019 announcement that this no longer put members of our community, the LGBT community, or LGB community, I should say, and with some exception, I suppose, in this category of murderers and
worse. No, it was worse than murderers and rapists.
That's right. Yeah, which was unbelievable. Whether that was an intended consequence, I don't know, but it was really unbelievable that was a category that they were put in as instant apostates. So,
and it was true with people. Same with people who lost their faith; they were put in that same position, right? And who talked openly about it, labeled apostates worse than murderers and rapists, right?
And in addition to that, then punished the children for Adam's transgression.
Right.
Interesting.
Okay. So any other comments about this mandatory list before we go to the optional list?
Yeah. So I'm not a lawyer, but I hire them. And I'm thinking, as I look through some of these things, that it's quite possible that there was a lawyer in the room.
It's basically all legal things, right?
Yeah, I mean, there are things that if the church is protecting or perpetuating, then maybe the church has some liability, and in terms of lawsuits and things like that. And so it's not all that. Plural marriage isn't going to result in the church being sued. But financial predatory behavior of like a stake president or some of these other things, if the church isn't doing something about it or showing that they're taking action, they're going to be a co-defendant in a lawsuit. So on some of them.
Right.
Can I ask, is the language felony used in that statement? Is that the word that they use, felony? Because we don't have felonies in New Zealand. So how on earth are people supposed to make sense of what a felony is, or second, third degree, or first degree felony, unless we're actually in the US judicial system? So once again, they make it really hard to interpret what the hell they mean.
Yeah, it says any felony conviction is the word.
And I think Natasha brings up a good point about the reciprocity of laws. You can go to a state and we'll just throw out the use of marijuana. You can go to a state like Colorado where recreational marijuana use is prohibited or allowed, but come to the state of Utah where you'd be arrested and charged with a felony for possession. So can you go to Colorado, recreationally smoke weed? And we can get into this under the new rules of the law of chastity as well, or the word of wisdom as well. But then you're fine and safe, and a bishop isn't going to prosecute that because it's not a felony, or convene a council. But then cross the state border into Utah, and immediately you become now subject to a new membership council. I think that is very problematic. Even though there might have been attorneys in the room, I don't know how they deal with the different rules in different states regarding different laws or countries, as Gina points out.
Mm-hmm.
Go
ahead.
I will say I have seen quite a bit of writing from the Lord's law firm, and this is not their best work.
So
by the way, that was Jana who mentioned that point. I'm going to give her credit.
Oh, sorry, Jana.
No worries. I have heard that rumors, and I don't know if this has been substantiated, but that this is kind of a first pass at all of this, right? We've got just 9 sections that have been rewritten or that have been added, and one's been rewritten. And the plan is to continue to revise this entire manual, the whole handbook, and that there is space for more localization into different countries and other things as this goes on. So I wouldn't be surprised if they actually start doing that and having different manuals available where felony means something different in your country.
Nice.
Yeah, that was in there's another icon that you can click on that has frequently asked questions, and they do talk about, just these limited sections, and that I think it's 2021 or 22. By that point, they're planning on releasing the rest of it. I would mention, kind of as we're going through this, that to a certain extent, I think maybe there was a level of mutiny on local levels, church-wide, with regard to executing excommunication for apostasy, for same-sex marriage, or considering it for cohabitation, because, I know with regard to our situation, we were highly confident that neither our bishop or stake president would call a disciplinary council for our son and his partner. So even though they live in Utah, we kept their records in Montana, because maybe they could have ended up in a ward like Dusty John's, where the stake president decides that he wants to, be a hardliner. And so, when we look at these things, they're the letter of the law, but at least with regard to some things, there is leadership roulette, and there might even be a degree of mutiny, on local levels, where bishops or stake presidents are just going to decide that that's crazy. We're not, if someone gets a felony for possession of an ounce of marijuana in Utah, maybe a bishop would be thoughtful and go, well, that's crazy. I'm not going to excommunicate someone over that. So,
or remove their membership. And just to go back to that point, Anthony and Kyle, you can confirm this. We've got, Dusty Johns and his beautiful, partner, they're getting, excommunicated. And then you hear about other wards where gay or lesbian couples attend regularly, and in some cases even have callings. Is that right, Kyle?
It is, and it's interesting. In Dusty's situation, he was excommunicated just a couple of weeks prior to the April reversal. And there are others like him who also went back and they appealed or contested their excommunication, and the First Presidency denied those, even though the rules had changed and they had appealed under those rules. So that doesn't make sense. The other interesting part is I traveled around working with stake presidents and bishops, helping them to better understand these LGBT topics within their wards and branches. And I learned that in some wards, even here in Utah, there were elders quorum presidents that were gay and dating, not married, which is how the bishops were justifying. But when you take an elders quorum president who is called by a stake, the stake president, which it means you have a progressive bishop and a progressive stake president who is willing to let a gay elders quorum president who was dating men, but living a chaste life, participate in that calling. I also learned of a sister who was a Relief Society president, a counselor in the Relief Society presidency, who were openly lesbian and also dating. So there is that level of progressivism out there, and I think that was another battle that the church had to address in this handbook, because they knew that the Fiddler on the Roof tradition wasn't the standard anymore, that there were other bishops and stake presidents out there that were living or instituting a different law, which I'm happy for. And they exist. They're all over. And the LGBT community is well aware of those bishops, which goes back into this whole discussion of roulette and how it is difficult to maintain a level playing field for all LGBTQ members in the church.
I'm a little confused about that, because on the one hand, sometimes the church gets characterized by critics as being controlling and corporate and top down. And so you would think they would want it all to be standard. They would want to have a consistency across and just make it really clear. On the other hand, I could see lawyers saying the more the top is involved, the more there's liability, the more there's a risk of being sued. And the sort of Brigham Young Mountain Meadows thing, where if you can push accountability down to the local leaders as much as possible, then they get the blame if something goes wrong, and there's never blame flowing upwards. But anybody have a theory as to why the church would want these decisions made at the local level when we would assume sometimes they'd want to be more controlling and uniform, top down?
I think that they really are more controlling top-down. As you read through the handbook, especially in the areas, the newer sections that deal with transgender members, over and over again, it mentions counseling with area authorities. Under the disciplinary membership council guidelines, there's several places where it says a council may be required and to consult with area leaders. So what they're doing is we're sweeping more and more of these policies under the rug, where instead of being out in the open in this new public, yay, we made it available for everybody handbook, more things are being restricted to now, instead of bishops and stake presidents, to area authorities. And we're taking even more power out of the hands of local bishops and stake presidents. Now that can be a good thing because bishops can become mavericks and kind of run off in a bad direction or a good direction, depending on your point of view. And they do have more freedom, but they're also instructed to consult a lot more often. And so
that's true.
It is more flexible, but at the same time, it isn't really. And we've moved things around. We've moved the goalposts a little bit, but anyone who really sees this new manual as an increase in transparency isn't looking into it very deeply.
I met with a stake president in California about a year ago who is really progressive and holds LGBTQ firesides for Sunday schools in his stake, and has really promoted this message. And he taught me an interesting concept about the manual, because I said at some point you have to be concerned about an area authority cracking down on what's happening here within your stake. And I was actually happy to see the new manual, the new handbook, contain the same language, but it's right in the very beginning. It's now like in the first or second or third page of the new handbook, but it specifically
I was just about
says,
to bring this up.
Leaders seek inspiration about which guidelines and optional resources to use to meet the members' needs. So and that's how this stake president justified what he was doing within his stake. He said, the manual is the manual, but the manual also tells me that I can seek my own inspiration to enforce the rules in the manual, or choose not to enforce those rules in the manual. And that was his justification for doing it. And interestingly enough, the new handbook, that language survives. Leaders are to seek inspiration about which guidelines and optional resources are to be used. Not this is the law of Moses, but I think leaving that door open may answer your question, John, in terms of culpability or liability. they can now go back and say, if it was the judge of Israel's decision, then that's what it is.
Remember, anytime there's a problem, whoever caused the problem was speaking as a man. That's a common thread that we see. Sure. And so I definitely agree that this is a way to push liability down the food chain a little bit.
Let me go to the list of optional, these are the behaviors where disciplinary or membership councils are optional. I want to hear if anybody wonders why some of these are optional. So attempted murder, sexual abuse, and I'm assuming it's sexual abuse where there isn't legal culpability, including assault and harassment. So sexual assault and sexual harassment are optional. Attempted murder is optional. Abuse of a spouse or another adult, optional. Adultery, optional. Okay, I'm okay with that. Fornication, optional. I'm okay with that. Same-sex relations, I guess I wish these weren't on the list at all, but I'm glad they're optional versus mandatory. Cohabitation, civil unions and partnerships, same-sex marriage, so that is on the list. Intensive or compulsive use of pornography that causes harm to the family, robbery, burglary, and theft, embezzlement, perjury, serious sins where while holding a position of authority or trust in the church or community, and the sin is widely known, abortion, patterns of serious sins, deliberate abandonment of family responsibilities, including non-payment of child support and alimony, sale of illegal drugs, and other serious criminal acts. Anybody have reflections on those optional behaviors for a membership council?
Something I find interesting is transgender members don't show up in either list.
That's true.
We're between the two.
Okay.
You live in the upside down.
Yes, in a lot of ways.
I guess that's good, right? To not be on the list?
Yes and no. I mean, I don't want to jump in kind of an interesting place where certain actions default to membership restrictions. And there is no council, they just happen. And then in other cases, we're no longer required to specifically undergo a council. And so it's this really strange, ambiguous place to be.
Sure. Anyone wondering why things like murder or attempted murder, sexual abuse, spouse abuse are optional?
Well, again, I think that this is where the legal team has a lot more say than mental health teams, for example. And I think it's because there's been no quote unquote proof or evidence. And so then they get into these kind of, they said, he said, she said scenarios. And, but I think where this is problematic, very much so, is that when it's not considered mandatory, and since the church hasn't really made very clear what should be mandatory as far as reporting to authorities, then so many of these kind of domestic abuses that happen between spouses and also parents and children are left to this realm of repentance, and instead of to the realm of criminal accountability, as well as correct mental health resources that these families should have access to. So I see this as very problematic, and why I wish we just would have very clear guidelines as far as reportable concerns. Because again, remember, to be a mandated reporter, you don't need a conviction. All you need is a suspicion or a concern, right? So if you have somebody in your office saying anything around my dad or my mom or my spouse, I'm scared, or it's not your job to decide whether or not it's happening. It's not your job to decide whether or not that person or somebody should repent, or how responsible they were, and whether or not they were the victim or the perpetrator. It's not the person's job. The person is to know that there's a red flag. This is something that is reportable. This is something that is beyond my scope of practice as an untrained ecclesiastical leader in my community, and I need to pass the buck. And this really, in a lot of ways, minimizes a lot of the concerns I have. Plus, then the things, the list of things that you mentioned, John, that, you wish weren't even on there, those things usually have to do with sexuality. And what that does is bring people into this, again, tradition that we have as a Mormon people to really participate in behavior that goes against the World Association's sexual rights document. And these sexual rights have to do with privacy, with self-determination, with the ability to not be punished for certain sexual behaviors or have consequences or face discrimination or bias or differences in your community because of your sexuality. So hugely problematic from that perspective as well.
I think it's really weird that, the maybe necessary, we're going to have like some same-sex couples being disciplined and some not. Some people who cohabitate disciplined and some not. Some civil unions, some adulterers getting disciplined and some not. Like, why in the world would we want this loosey-goosey thing where it totally is random as to who's getting punished or not? It seems really unstable.
Because you're going to have dozens and dozens of bishops who are calling the hotline or calling their area authority, and it just bogs the system. So it's interesting that maybe they're creating a system of, here are the musts, and then here are the gray areas you tried to decide on your own, which again, I think just throws it right back into the whole member leadership roulette issue. And it's problematic.
It is, and this is a system we've had for a long time. This is not new. There are people who have committed adultery that are and are not disciplined already. So that's not new, and it is a problematic part of this leadership roulette. But it does seem to me that I agree with Natasha. It has a lot to do with legalities, I think, because, obviously, if you are convicted of attempted murder, that throws you under the must, right? So it's not just the fact that attempted murder is an issue. It seems to be that it's, were you convicted of it? Which I just think throwing this ecclesiastical thing onto the judicial system is highly problematic for a number of reasons. Not the least of which would be just bias in the system. There's racial bias in legal systems. There's all kinds of bias. And that's not perfect either, but it is a way to just make it easy for people to say, well, if the courts have decided, then there you go.
And it is, speaking from my own personal situation, it does get quite problematic. When I came out as transgender, my ex-wife hired a rather dirty attorney, and as dirty attorneys are prone to do, they took they threw as much mud as they could to see what would stick. And so my ex-wife immediately went to the bishop, the stake president, and the court made allegations of sexual and verbal and emotional abuse, and just some really nasty things, and none of which were true. And I spent about $10,000 shooting down all those allegations. And it was even to the point where a couple members of stake leadership and their wives, who I had never met, the only way I knew who they were is because I put names into LDS tools to figure out who the heck are these people, were testifying on her behalf.
In court.
Exactly. They never actually testified in court. They just filed affidavits with the court because we didn't get that far. But some really interesting handling of it. And thank God we had a really good judge, because there's another judge down here in Utah County who I won't mention names, but it would have gone very, very differently with of how much he hates transgender people and the fact that my attorney was a gay man. And I've watched this particular, not judge, but commissioner in a different case completely rake my attorney over the coals over stupid things. And
tell us, how are you tying this back to these policies?
So there was a lot of discussion about, I think it was Jana that said throwing the burden on the legal system is problematic in a lot of ways.
Oh, because the legal system's problematic, yeah.
But again, though, on the other hand, is it any less problematic than the church?
Yeah, it's just...
And, both systems are very reliant on human beings making good judgments.
Yeah, I think Gina's right. Gina, just get out of this business, right?
Yeah.
Natasha, too, yeah.
And past... I had an employee whose brother went through something similar, and while the charges were pending, he was essentially disfellowshipped until there was a verdict.
Right.
His temple recommend was taken away. He was told not to partake of the sacrament, etc. The verdict came through that he was innocent. Then he was returned to full fellowship. So with the church, at least in several situations I'm aware of, it became a guilty until proven innocent situation.
Right. That's a problem too.
In mine, thankfully, the church said, well, we're already disciplining you for being trans, so there's nothing else for us to do. So I never got to see how that worked out.
Sorry about that. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'd comment. I think of the different bishops and stake presidents who I've had and served with over the years, and they were chiropractors and plumbers and accountants and dentists and medical doctors. There just weren't that many who were in law enforcement,
The
and
rules
so
of evidence are incredibly complex, even for those of us who study them.
Yeah. And so it's not in their skill set or purview to investigate some of these things that are really disputed. And if they see something that should be reported to law enforcement, then they should report it, But I agree with Gina that it would be beneficial to get out of this kind of business and to put a dentist or a chiropractor or a home constructor, contractor, in the role of trying to adjudicate something and investigate something like this. My sense is that it's not helpful, and the legal system that has people that are already trained and has standards messes up a lot, like Samantha's mentioning some of those cases. How often do things get messed up when we have people that this isn't really their skill set, they're not trained for it, and they're trying to adjudicate, milk strippings, referring to Thomas Marsh.
Right.